Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here so early on a Sunday morning. I really appreciate it. My name is Bernadette DiPino, and I'm the police chief in Sarasota, Florida. With me is Captain Kevin Stiff, who is currently in a position with our city as the homeless outreach coordinator for our city, and also our legal advisor for the city of Sarasota, and specifically for our police department, Joe Polzak. Just a few housekeeping items. I just would like to remind you that the following activities are prohibited in this workshop: the taking of flash photos during the session, unless we put our sunglasses on, taking photos of the slide presentations. Don't worry about that. We actually have a flash drive with the entire presentation. It will also be on the ICP's website, and there will be video of this presentation for you to use in the future. And this session is being video recorded and will be available to ICP members only on their website in approximately 2 weeks. If we are able to take audience questions, please step to the microphone, which is in the center of the room, to ask your questions and speak clearly. We will do that towards the end of the session. So we are really honored and excited to be here to share with you our homeless outreach team the program this morning. And please stand by and watch our video about our program. Hi, I'm Chief Bernadette DiPino with the Sarasota Police Department. I'm so proud to be able to present to you the Sarasota Police Department's Homeless Outreach Team model. We think this is a great program that your agency can implement within your organization to help you reduce homelessness. Now, I'm going to be frank with you. There's no way you're ever going to be able to eliminate homelessness in your community. But what you can do is help reduce homelessness and help individuals, one at a time, get into resources and programs to help them get off the streets. This is good for your police officers, it's good for your community, it's good for your elected officials, because what it does is it takes homeless individuals with police officers engaging with them and helps pair them up with social services to help them get out of homelessness on the street and into the help that they need.
As a mayor for the city of Sarasota, on behalf of our city commission and the entire city of Sarasota, I just want to say a special thank you to the International Association of Chief of Police, and thank you for welcoming Chief Bernadette DiPino of the Sarasota Police Department and her team that's making their presentation at your conference.
Of the homeless outreach team was to try to give the community new tools to try to resolve cases and solve the problems. And we've learned so much during that process. We've learned from talking with the folks involved and meeting the people on the streets that a high percentage of those on the streets are suffering from serious mental health challenges and substance abuse challenges. And we have to create a system in communities that can problem solve and bring the services to the people and see positive outcomes. It's certainly a healthy way to approach it. It's a compassionate way to approach it. And it actually, I think, in the end, saves taxpayers money. And the homeless outreach team is, I think, a reasonably effective, proactive way to counter the challenge and to see positive outcomes.
What's up, Jay?
One of the major steps that we took at the recommendation of law enforcement was the creation of H.O.T teams, and those are homeless outreach teams where a law enforcement officer is paired with case manager. Because homeless individuals are transient and don't have transportation, that was the gap, getting individuals to the services. And so at the recommendation of law enforcement and with partnerships with case management, we were able to bring services to individuals that were in need. And for individuals who had been chronically homeless, it took several attempts, but with continuing to see familiar faces, faces of hope, faces of encouragement, they slowly warmed up to law enforcement and case managers and began to accept services.
Strategy has evolved to educate the chronically homeless to what the services are that are available to them, to encourage them to participate in taking advantage of those services. And then when all else fails and the behavior falls into criminal behavior, we do enforce our code. So the 3 E's have proved to be very effective, and that involves caseworkers working with law enforcement to actually understand what each individual is going through. And we've also found and discovered that there's a way to actually solve this problem and get out of that cycle, the very expensive cycle of arrests, courts, emergency room transports from the fire department to the emergency rooms in the hospitals, all of which just kept repeating itself.
So I think that shift was critical. I think it also transformed as policymakers the way that we address issues in terms of blaming the victim as opposed to being a partner in the solution. And when our law enforcement officers and our case managers and our community partners do that, what the individual says is that I have value and that it's worth listening to the services that they have to offer and that I can do better and there are options and people actually care about me. And it was pretty significant in terms of individuals who were living and sleeping on the streets, causing problems in terms of relationships with our business community, and just safety issues with their drivers in terms of approaching cars and panhandling and those kind of things. And so it was pretty crying.
So our goal today for you is to share with you our challenges, how we developed our homeless outreach program and our city ordinances within our city, and then also share our successes. So if your goal is to end homelessness within your communities, if you're looking for that Emerald City and following that yellow brick road to where you don't have homeless anymore, I'll give you a couple of seconds. You can get up and leave because that is not what this program is about. Our goal is, it's not a solution to end homelessness. It's actually a program to help mitigate and manage homelessness within your community. So I'm glad to see you're all still here because we really put together a great program and it's taken a while for us to get here. But let's talk about some of the challenges that we faced. Many of the things in our community, I'm sure if you take a look at the slide here, your own communities might have these issues. You know, people laying along the streets, camps set up, complaints from your citizens. And one of our biggest challenges in Florida is the weather, because everybody in the whole rest of the country is cold, but it's nice and sunny and warm in Florida. So guess where everybody wants to come in the wintertime? I mean, people flee from the north and all the cold weather to come to Florida. And actually, people put it on their calendars. I know, because I was one of those people. I'm from Maryland originally and then moved to Sarasota 5 years ago just to get away from the weather. So when I actually got the job in Sarasota, my vision was, oh my gosh, I have landed in paradise. It's a beautiful beach and there's culture and you've got so many fabulous restaurants and attractions here. But right away, I started to find out and realize that I didn't necessarily land in the paradise that I thought that I landed in. I actually found that our community was in the grips of a very serious problem, and that was homelessness. We had crisis on our hands, and this is what I encountered when I was riding down the streets, you know, getting myself familiar with the city here. I'm thinking I've landed in this great place, and I was used to people. I worked in Ocean City, Maryland. We had 8 million visitors a year. I knew there weren't any challenges I couldn't face until I saw streets filled with trash bags, filled with garbage, or what the people that had them called their personal belongings, and people were sleeping and lying in places where you don't traditionally sleep and lie, like doorways. And then we ended up dealing with complaints from our business owners and our citizens, and people were sleeping in places that were not meant for human habitation. And then let's add some of the crimes that were associated with homelessness, from people stabbing each other or pouring gasoline on each other and setting themselves on fire, let alone the complaints that we were getting from citizens in the community. And then I find out that Sarasota is named the meanest city in the whole United States. That's the Homeless Coalition, the National Coalition of Homelessness names us the meanest city. I'm like, okay, what are we going to do about this? And this is because we were banning people sleeping on overnight without permission on places. And then before I got there, the city banned sleeping on benches and actually took the benches out of the city. And it didn't help that one of our officers ended up arresting a homeless person for using electricity to charge their free government phone at an area which was open to the public. So we had a black eye. We had a bad reputation going about how our interactions and handling of homeless was. People thought we were just arresting our way out of homelessness. So then when I got to Sarasota as the chief, I found out that there had been emails or texts sent back and forth between our police officers about bum hunting, which is a horrible name to call individuals that are without homes. And then I had just before I got into Sarasota, and I remember talking to the city manager about it and seeing it on TV, one of our officers went to arrest a homeless man at our bus depot and grabbed him by the arm, and the guy resisted. And when you see the video, if you just saw the video and didn't know anything else, it looked like our officer just slammed this homeless gentleman into a wall and causing him injury. But when you really broke it down and saw, you could see that the gentleman resisted arrest. The officer was just trying to pull him up off of the bench, and the guy was intoxicated and fell over and hit into the wall. And that's what I was stepping into as a brand new chief within the Sarasota Police Department. So my paradise, beautiful, going south for the duration turned into somewhat of a nightmare, because 80% of what I was dealing with as a police chief was homeless issues and complaints about homelessness. As a matter of fact, the Washington Post, a newspaper I was very familiar with, being from the Baltimore, Washington area and living in Ocean City most of my life, dubbed us the meanest city in America, and said that we were in the fiercest and most anguished battle over homelessness in the entire country. We became ground zero for homelessness within the nation. And we know that it is actually a national problem. I'm sure while you are sitting here, you're here because you're facing homeless issues and challenges with organizations, and we'll talk about that a lot, like the ACLU. And again, it's a national problem. And any given night in the United States, there's over 500,000 homeless out on our streets sleeping. And there's 5 states that have over half of those individuals in their state: New York, Washington, Texas, California, and Florida. So I really found myself facing a lot of challenges. And homelessness is, again, a grave national problem. But it's about chronically homeless that we're really facing the biggest challenge. And that's what we were facing. We had people sleeping in places that were not supposed to be inhabited by human beings. So our challenges, again, and I'm sure you're seeing it play out on your streets, is that there's got to be a way to be able to handle this, because we had challenges that not only dealing with the homelessness, which all of you, I'm sure, understand how challenging that can be because of the mental health issues, the addictions issues, the economic issues, and especially if somebody's out on the street for years and years. But then let's throw in the policymakers. We had our city government, we had our elected officials, we had our other social services organizations, we had a continuum of care, we had policy groups, we had our neighborhood organizations, and let's just now throw in the county government, because we're city government. We had all of these people deciding how we were going to take action on homelessness. And it was ended up being a huge infighting, a huge issue with all of these fractions battling to tell us what we needed to do to be able to address homelessness. And it was really challenging. And everybody's pointing fingers at each other like it's your responsibility and you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And everybody was saying the same thing: you got to take action. You have to take action. And I was like, have you ever herded cats before? Because that's what I felt like I was doing. It's like, okay, let's get everybody all together. And anybody that ever follows hurricanes, and I'm now officially a Florida chief, I was told, because I just survived my first hurricane, Hurricane Irma. So if you follow the tracks of the hurricanes, that's how all the policymakers were telling us how we should address homelessness. No, don't arrest. Yes, arrest. Respond, don't respond. It's not the police problem, which I still to this day believe that homelessness is not a police-related problem, but it is something that we are looked at to be responsible for. And that's because we're the only people that pick up the phone, answer the phones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and actually can address the problems. Now, the craziest thing that I found was that there were these fractions within our community. Half of our community wanted to put everybody, all the homeless, on a barge. Literally, this is what they said: put them on a barge, send them out into the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic, and sink it. And then you had the other half that said, oh no, we need to build them mansions. We need to build them really nice houses, give them housing and provide them with money, and they need to be coddled and cared for. And here we are at law enforcement in between. So here we're looking at what do we do? And then beware of experts, and you'll hear about this coming into your communities telling you they have the magic silver bullet, which there is no silver bullet for ending homelessness. I'll tell you that right up front. There is none. Be careful of them saying you need a come-as-you-are shelter in your community. Do not let them do that to you, because if you've ever seen that baseball movie, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. And if you are the center for where a location where people can drop off homeless for violations of criminal infractions, your region will then filter everything to you. And we already, in the city of Sarasota, had a 250-bed Salvation Army. So we already had our own shelter within our community. And for them to want to build another one that was a come-as-you-are shelter, to me was going to be a significant impact on our resources and in our community. And with all of this discord, with all that was going on within our community, the policymakers and the government officials and our police officers and everybody, of course what was going to happen was we get sued. We have litigation. We've got lawsuits that came, and the ACLU is huge, and I'm sure that's who you're facing is challenging you. And what we ended up doing is we had the Cross case, which tried to impose Pottinger, and you'll hear about that a little bit later on, onto our community. And we figured we've got to do something about this because this was impacting our operations. We had a panhandling ordinance that was pretty effective, and it was about aggressive panhandling and not panhandling out in the middle of our median strips. So we even had to modify our operations, and you'll learn about some of the city ordinances that have been tested in the highest levels of court in the state of Florida and found to be legally sufficient. And then go on to, it was impacting our police officers and what they were doing and the scrutiny that they were put under. Our officers were making mistakes with the handling of homeless, and you'll learn how we ended up putting training programs together for our officers to know what they do when they encounter homeless. And I hope that you hadn't heard this story, but I'm not scared to share it because it is quite embarrassing and quite telling. One of our officers, and let me clarify that, one of our former police officers, because he's no longer with our agency, arrested a homeless individual. He was in the jail, and where there's cameras all over the place, the individual wanted something to eat. The officer had some, which everybody thought was peanuts. I think it ended up being cashews. It doesn't matter, had nuts. And the guy said, can you give me something to eat? So the officer didn't want to touch him, so he throws it to the homeless guy, like in his mouth, like to toss it in his mouth, and it falls on the ground. So he tries again, and it falls on the ground. And at that point, the homeless gentleman, still handcuffed, decides to go down onto the ground and eat the nuts off the ground. And what does our former officer do? He goes over and he kicks the peanuts into the mouth of the individual. Talk about a nightmare situation when we're trying to mitigate homelessness in a fair and compassionate way, but also following the rule of law. And this is what we're dealing with, such a negative publicity for a community where we were trying to change the culture, trying to change the narrative that was so negative on us. The media was attacking us, the elected, everybody was looking at and scrutinizing our operations when it dealt with homelessness. It impacted our community relations. We actually had protesters in front of our building, telling us that how horrible we were and our treatment of the homeless was horrible. And I knew we had an obligation as law enforcement officers to do the right thing. That is our mission. We have to figure a way to help individuals in a holistic way. And our job is to protect and serve people. So I knew that we needed to come up with a program. We needed to come up with something because our mission is to help people to mitigate situations, whether it's the complainants or the individuals that are homeless, and be able to do it in a fair and impartial way, following the rule of law, but also enforcing the law when it's appropriate. So I rolled up my sleeves And I said, okay, here's our big challenge. I have to come up with some type of an initiative to help us mitigate this homeless problem. So the first thing I did was I hired an attorney. And that's who Joe is right now. And I tell you, it was not necessarily, you think about, oh, lawyers, well, you're going to hire a lawyer. Absolutely. I hired a legal advisor, and I selected my patrol division captain, the best that I had in my organization. And I asked them to do the following things. I need you to go out into the whole United States, even worldwide, find out some national best practices or international best practices. I want you to bring us standardized policies and procedures to our organization. I want you to visit some shelters, especially the Come As You Are shelters, because they were really big on pushing a Come As You Are shelter in our community. Find out what's happening in those communities. Dig out a little bit more than the tour that the expert was giving, and find out what the community and the impacts of a Come As You Are shelter was on the community. And then develop our own program targeted towards the people that are out on the street, and how can we mitigate homelessness. So I picked my team. And the one on the right, the skipper, is my captain, and that's his face when I told him, you're going on this 3-hour tour, which ended up being probably over a 3-year tour, and to go look into homelessness, which is probably the last thing that a patrol captain was interested in. And of course, the lawyer's Gilligan, for all the obvious reasons. And
Chief, you didn't tell me about this slide.
Yeah, I threw this in last minute. And you can see the look on his face, and that look is because, what does a lawyer have to do with homeless issues, and why am I involved in this? But I'm really proud of the team that we put together, and I am excited to share this program with you and show you the successes that we've had with this program. We will take questions at the end of the program. We do have, as I said, a flash drive for those of you who would like to have a copy of it. Plus, I give you unlimited access to our homeless outreach team. If you want to visit Sarasota, I'm sure especially some of you in those colder temperatures, if you want to come down in January and February, we'll be happy to accommodate you to come visit our location. My business card, Kevin and Joe's business cards are up here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My cell phone number is on my card. And now it gives me great honor to introduce you my patrol captain, who's just recently retired. And we were lucky to be able to encourage him to come back and accept a position as our homeless coalition coordinator for the city of Sarasota. So I'm still going to be working closely with him, and he's going to take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Can everybody hear me? I don't know if my mic's working or not, but regardless. Yes, that's a look on the face of a 38-year law enforcement person that said, homelessness is not a problem for police officers, and especially not a problem for someone that's been a cop for 38 years. But I took the position. We started homeless outreach teams, but before that we had an opportunity to work with an expert. I am not an expert on homelessness. If you need an expert on homelessness, please call me. There is no shortage of experts that call me each day and tell me they have the solution if I would just do it. But we did what most cities do when they don't have a solution to a problem. They hire an expert. Our expert showed up and said the solution was out west. And out west we went, and I thought, this is a great opportunity for me. A buddy of mine was going on this trip with me. It was going to be great. We were going to go places we hadn't seen before, eat at some good restaurants, drink some beer, have a good time. We went to San Antonio, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Phoenix, Arizona. We had an opportunity to speak with the policymakers and the social service organizations that worked at these shelters. One of the shelters we went to on this tour was a very nice shelter. We go to the shelter, we're spending 2 days there. For about one afternoon, while we're at this shelter, they give us a list of things that's going on. And I look at the list and I said, well, all that list is about social stuff. And I'm not a social worker, so I don't need to go. So I said, I'm going to go out in the community and talk to the people that live around the shelter, that live downtown in residence, and see what they think about the shelter. Because they told me everyone that was involved in the shelter or lived around the shelter loved the shelter. They said they love the shelter because they get to come in and use services. So everybody thinks this is great, and we've solved homelessness in this city. So as I asked to leave, little did I know that I checked in Hotel California. They kept telling me I couldn't leave. We could not let you leave. we can't take responsibility for you. I finally ended up walking to a gate and said, let me out. And out I went. I had an opportunity to talk to numerous law enforcement officers who said that the shelter had not solved their homeless problem. They said for the first 2 years, everything was great. Homelessness did decrease in their downtown corridor. But 2 years later, all of the people that we all have problems with had been kicked out of that shelter, did not go to houses, and other citizens in other cities that wanted to bring homeless to a solution brought them to the shelter. So their problem was just as bad or worse than it had ever been. Residents around the shelter, I talked to them. They said, we're sick and tired of urination, defecation, panhandling, and car burglaries in our neighborhood. I said, well, how do you know they're panhandling? How do you know they're from the shelter? They said they're wearing their tag around their neck. Talked to businesses. They said we cannot get anybody to come down to our businesses anymore. They won't come down here. They don't want to be panhandled. So I talked to homeless individuals, and they said, of course, that yes, and probably justly so, they'd been trespassed from the shelter and couldn't go there anymore. So that evening, I felt like Cary Grant, because when they asked me what I had found, I told them, not everybody loves your shelter. Matter of fact, there's a lot of people that say you have not solved the homeless problem. I said, if you've solved the homeless problem, you have a perception problem. They don't know it. So we went to the trip. We went to all the places. There are some phenomenal places out there doing great things for homeless individuals. But we did not find any city that had solved the homeless problem. So back to what did the expert tell us? The expert told us that we needed to build another 250-bed come-as-you-are shelter in our downtown corridor. Why our downtown corridor? It's because that's where the services are. You can't use the Salvation Army because it's a church and it's not sufficient. We should have homeless outreach teams, but do not use homeless outreach teams until 3 months before a shelter opens. I have a critical problem now. A homeless shelter is not going to open for 2 years. And if we did not follow his instructions, we would have a 15 to 25% increase in our downtown corridor over the next 2 years. Well, the wringing of hands and the mashing of jaws continued for quite some time, for at least a couple of weeks, in city commission meetings, county meetings, neighborhood meetings, the cost of a shelter. Why weren't you building a shelter? You hired an expert. He said a 250-bed shelter is a solution. Do something. And now you're asking, why the city of Sarasota? Why are we we are 15 square miles, but why are we so important about homelessness? From 2011 to 2014, our population had jumped by 40%. The city of Sarasota had 6 times the national average of homeless individuals in its downtown corridor. Our county had twice the national average. And, we'll talk about this later, this was solely a city problem. We had 1,106 homeless people in our downtown corridor. The county, all total, was 550 square miles. City of Sarasota, 15 square miles of that. You will notice down at the bottom, the county was doing a phenomenal job. They only had 1 homeless person in the entire county, wasn't in the city. But during this, we were getting sued for trespass enforcement, public records. They'll even sue you for records or notes from a trip. That's how contentious this went. Notes I took on the trip, they sued to get them. They didn't get them, but they tried. If they're not suing us for the constitutionality of the law, they're suing us for the facial, well, not the constitutionality, they're suing as applied. The law is constitutional, but your officers are applying it incorrectly. What was useful and what wasn't useful? We had to decide, because we needed to take action, not so much for the community, but as the patrol captain, my officers 100 times a day are going out, interacting with homeless individuals, trying to figure out how to do this. And you know what a police officer does? I don't know what a police officer after 38 years figures out. If you don't want to be sued, end up on the front page of the newspaper or in internal affairs, do nothing. Because that's where you felt was going to happen. You're going to end up on the front page of the Sarasota Herald Tribune trying to arrest a homeless person. So We had to do something as an agency and a city to figure out how we get through this. So I did what any good cop did. I went undercover. However, not undercover in any good way. I went undercover as a social worker. During our trip, I did have an opportunity to go to San Diego. San Diego for years has been using homeless outreach teams, so I did not invent homeless outreach teams. Also went to Broward County. Broward County is an organization that also has been dealing with homelessness since the 80s, and Joe Polzak will tell you about that. What is a homeless outreach team? We hired a case manager to work with a police officer. Why a police officer? And at this point, I was still in the field that cops do not need to be involved in this. But everybody in here has a homeless problem, has a police officer that works with them and knows where to find every homeless person in your city, knows what their drug of choice is, knows where they're from, knows what their family is. But I will tell you, you need a social worker. Why? Because the network of social services is vast and difficult to figure out. I've been working with it for 4 years, and I still haven't figured out, okay, you can do this program, but you can't do this program. You could do this program if you had $10 more of income. So we are a bridge to services. I tell them all the time. We're going to build a bridge to services. Our homeless outreach teams will put people on it, and we're going to shove as many across to the social services we can get. So we started homeless outreach teams. There's a couple of our case managers, the sergeant in charge of the team, and the red-headed guy is Dave Dubendorf. He has been working with homeless since 2011. I know this does not look at it like it, but this is a cemetery. It's a city cemetery in our city. There's about 75 people living here. It is one of 22 camps that we had in our city when we started this. We did what we always do when it comes to camps. We send the homeless outreach teams in first, try to figure out a way to get these people to services or other accommodations within our city. We got a homeward bound system. And we're working through that. We even had the Humane Society coming in to get the animals. We just didn't want to leave them. But we had to stop. The ACLU said our expert told us that homeless outreach teams do no good unless you have a shelter. And I thought, well, we do have a shelter. It's called Salvation Army. But that shelter was not sufficient. And not only was the ACLU saying this, but the own expert we hired was doing interviews with the newspaper and TV telling us that we were wrong. Everything we were doing was wrong. We should not be using homeless outreach teams. So the city commission, doing what most city commissions do, they said stop. And we stopped doing homeless outreach. Fast forward about 3 weeks, when one of the residents of that camp threw gasoline on another resident of that camp and tried to set him aflame, they said, why aren't you doing anything? We said, you said stop. So we stopped. Needless to say, this camp was a camp that had at least one murder, numerous rapes, several batteries, and a lot of thefts. So we went in and cleaned the camp up. We began moving forward with our homeless outreach teams. Today, we have 3 camps in our city, which are much smaller than this. So we were back to doing homeless outreach. But wait, we had more gifts to come from our expert. He brought us a monster. You know, the monster that's the elephant in the room that every time someone talks about a topic, the monster rattles the door and you have to quit talking about it or he'll sue you. Well, that monster for us is Pottinger, and it comes out of Miami. And here to talk to you about Pottinger is Joe Polzak.
Thank you, sir. Of course, the lawyer gets introduced for the bad part of the presentation, so thank you guys. But no, this is a very important topic. How many lawyers do we have in the room? Not just me?
We're
One?
lucky.
One other one? Okay, great. Much more fun to talk to a crowd of non-lawyers, so I'll spare a lot of the legal minutia. But how many have heard of Pottinger, the case Pottinger? Okay. Yeah, the captain and I like to say that there's 2 cities that know about Pottinger. One is the city of Miami, that was the site of the lawsuit. And the second one is the city of Sarasota, where it was being thrust upon us. So, but anyway, we'll go through some of the important aspects of the case because it is scary. And it was the boogeyman in Sarasota. And it was a critically important case in the city of Miami that did wreak a lot of havoc upon the city of Miami and also upon the city of Sarasota. So we'll talk about what it is, It was a long period of time of appeals and mediations, culminating in a settlement agreement between the City of Miami and the ACLU that had some very important effects, really nationwide. We also got, as the chief mentioned, our own version of Pottinger, called the Cross case, seek to impose a Pottinger claim upon our city. You'll see we're not unique in this as I go forward. So it is a settlement agreement. It never reached the point of trial or a case being resolved through litigation and a jury and that kind of thing. But it was a very important settlement agreement, and one that involved essentially 8 protocols that law enforcement in the City of Miami had to adopt to comply with the ACLU's demands. So we'll go through them. Obviously, this had applied with the government's interaction with the homeless. Again, this was a decade of litigation. There was 2 trials, 2 different settlements. The most current form was enacted in 2013, was a little bit lesser version, lesser demands than the prior settlement. Obviously, it had to define a homeless person, which is pretty much what you think. But as you get further into the topic, you'll see that there's a lot of legal definitions for who is considered homeless. And that does have important impacts on your programming. Importantly, it required documentation of government contacts with the homeless. As we'll see in our programming, this was a very important thing. And the ACLU wanted to have the City of Miami document all their contacts with the homeless so they knew what was going on. And make no mistake, the city or the ACLU was continuing to audit Miami's programming. They had teams of college students pouring through basically every record that the police department was creating. So the agreement really applied to life-sustaining conduct misdemeanors, which, as we'll see, this is a very important definition. It has to do with crimes that you would commit because of the mere fact that you're homeless. So things like eating outdoors, sleeping outdoors, maybe sitting on sidewalks, congregating in public spaces, that kind of thing. Things that just by your very nature of homelessness, you have no choice but to maybe violate some city or county code. It also gave an important legal definition, which had wide-ranging impacts for what's an available shelter. The Pottinger agreement specified that it has to be at least 24 hours. That, importantly, it includes a bed or a mat that is at least 3 inches thick. It's at no cost to the homeless person. It's within the city, so there's not displacement of individuals out of their home jurisdiction. And that there's no religious or therapeutic programming included as a requirement to partake of that shelter. These are very important definitions that we incorporate in our programming. Most importantly, it required this available shelter to be there anytime law enforcement is going to enforce what we've previously defined as life-sustaining conduct crimes. So if you do not have that shelter available, you cannot enforce. If you have the shelter available and the person accepts it, there could be no enforcement action. The only enforcement action can take place is if there is that presently available shelter and they reject it. And you'll see in our programming that's exactly what we incorporated into our code. It also established protections for their personal property, their belongings and things that were throughout the city. Again, there was a history, unfortunately, in Miami of their property being displaced, of the homeless individuals being displaced. It was pretty wide-ranging activities that the ACLU inspected and made part of this litigation. And then it did require training of law enforcement, particularly to deal with the unique struggle that homeless individuals face in society. And Miami has implemented that training, and so have we in our programming. Now, very important to note that Pottinger does not apply to felonies or any other misdemeanor or crime that is not life-sustaining conduct. Pottinger is very narrowly applied to typically local codes that cover these life-sustaining conduct, camping ordinances, congregating on the sidewalks, that kind of thing, as we'll see. Also, extremely important, nothing in Pottinger says how many shelter beds that you have to have in your jurisdiction or who has to own and operate those beds. Now, this is critically important because in Sarasota, as I mentioned, we had a Pottinger claim thrust on us through which they seemed to say that we had to have shelter beds equivalent to our population of homeless individuals, as measured by the HUD, U.S. Housing and Urban Development surveys. So that's critically important because that can dictate a number that's much larger than what your jurisdiction may be able to afford in terms of shelter space. So the bottom line, not to get too much into the legal background of the case, but it's very important because it has acquired status as legal and policy precedent. Case in point, another case from the city of Miami in the year 2000, Joel versus the city of Orlando, where their camping ordinance was challenged and subject to scrutiny under the Constitution, under this analysis that they can't enforce that ordinance where there's no presently available shelter. Orlando survived that case, but Pottinger was cited and used. Orlando survived by being able to show unrefuted evidence that they had shelter space that was available 100% of the time in the subject time period of the litigation. Now, that's a pretty hard standard to reach. I'm not exactly sure how they did that, but let's look a little bit further in time. 2015, I don't know if people in the room have heard of the City of Boise case, Bell versus City of Boise. The U.S. Department of Justice actually intervened in that case with a position paper. Now, this case is still ongoing. It's been ongoing for years, similar to Pottinger, in various forms. It was dismissed and appealed. There was just appellate action this summer on this case. It's still pending. But what the DOJ's position was, again, and this invokes the Eighth Amendment prohibition against punishing somebody's status, that you cannot criminalize an activity that the person has no choice in committing. So there's not mens rea, there's not a criminal intent, just by their mere status of homelessness, that their life-sustaining activities are criminalized. Again, the same type of logic from Pottinger. So we looked at what's called the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. It's a 19-agency federal task force that leads the national effort to prevent and end homelessness and foster partnerships at every level of government to take action on a government level and the private sector, including the DOJ. They put out some work product, common sense type of stuff that localities need to invest in programs that work and don't subject themselves to liability. Their most important work product was called the Searching Out Solutions, published in 2012. This report came out of a summit, and it identified 3 categories of what they called potential solutions from the summit that involved stakeholders from across the country. And these are best practices that we've incorporated into our programming. 1, importantly, 24 hours access to shelter, again, akin to Pottinger, using street outreach teams to connect the homeless with that available shelter. 2, collaboration between government and private sector to connect people with services. 3, implementation of alternative justice system strategies to create diversion programs and, again, link people with services in lieu of criminal citation. These are all things that we incorporate into our programming. And in doing so, you can feel the monster is somewhat tamed. Made friends with the monster, it's not so bad. Once it's out of the closet and you take a look at what it actually is, it's very common sense in its nature and the programming that can accomplish what Pottinger seeks to impose. So let's look at how the architecture of our programming, how we built it to both accommodate the issues in our city and withstand a Pottinger type of challenge. Sir?
Thank you. So we had to land somewhere. As I said, our police officers are still dealing with the complaints 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no shortage of problems that the officers have to deal with, the complaints from the citizens and the complaints from our city manager and the city commission about do something. So me and Joe went to work trying to figure out how do we get more predictable outcomes. We've had some dumb luck, we've had some bad breaks, but what kind of process can we put together that we can say this is what we're doing and how we're doing it? We were already doing outreach. Outreach is going out on the street, providing information to the homeless individuals. These are the services available to you. Diversion. Nobody wants to arrest their way out of homelessness, and that's what we had been accused of. The city of Sarasota is just trying to arrest their way out of homelessness. Even the sheriff's department didn't like the fact that he claimed that we were filling his jail with petty crimes. Now, nobody wants to have people arrested constantly for open container and other city violations. So we were training our officers. These are the services available. When possible, divert these individuals to services. Case management. Beyond the outreach team, the person goes to the shelter, there has to be someone that helps them through the process. And then, of course, we will enforce the law. We, by definition, are law enforcement officers. Then I needed a way to transmit this information to everybody in our system. The lawyers, the city commission, the county commission, anybody, the officers, everyone has to know this is what we're going to do. So we came up with the 3 E's. We're going to educate about social services. We're going to educate everybody, the officers, the citizens, the commission. We're encouraging people through outreach and diversion to partake in those services. And yes, those who do not wish to take part in services and continue to break the law, we will enforce the law. We refer to it as our 3 E's, and if you watch the program at the beginning, you saw the message from the city manager. Even he knows what the 3 E's are. Outreach. The H.O.T team does a majority of our outreach, but every police officer is trained on how to do outreach. All the homeless outreach teams have a case manager. They go out every day. They go to all the camps trying to find these individuals. As I say, there's not a homeless individual in Sarasota that has not been spoken to by the homeless outreach team. The officers receive education every year by policy on what social services are available. When they make contact, they encourage the individuals. We, during our opportunity to educate everyone, we developed a resource guide. This resource guide was printed by the police department. It gives a list of all the resources in the continuum of care. There is a continuum of care with 28 different social service programs available. It even includes how to get a shelter for your dog should you need one, how to contact the homeless outreach team. By policy, police officers on every contact with a homeless individual have to provide them a resource guide. The officers are asked to encourage the individual to do one of 2 things. Take a ride to the Salvation Army, allowed to be a ride to one of the other social service programs, or have the homeless outreach team contact them and assist them to services. This is another camp in our city where our case manager doing outreach. Outreach is meeting the person where they are, when they are, and how they are mentally. Many of these individuals, I will tell you, I've been working with the social service programs for 4 years. Many of these individuals do not want to get on a social service program for one reason. They've ridden on that train. They know in 2 weeks they're going to be right back on the corner where they started. They don't want to ride that train all around to be told there's no services available for them. So as we're going to talk about later, the other side of that bridge, you need to make sure something's over there. Diversion. Our biggest diversion in our camp, of course, is trespass. Many of these individuals are trespassing either on private property or they're illegally on government property, but we don't arrest them. We attempt to divert them to other locations or other services. And yes, we enforce the law. We encourage the officers during the training, if you have an opportunity during your encounters with homeless individuals, make sure that you've educated and encouraged them before we've reached enforcement. So in other words, this brand new person that has never been in the city of Sarasota before and has no idea what open container violation is or lodging at a door violation is, please take the time before enforcement to provide them that information, provide them the resource guide. But even if we do arrest them, we should still provide them the information about how to contact the homeless outreach team. The outreach team can meet them at the jail, provide them the resource guide. So, I know we all want to know one thing about enforcement in the city code and how do we do it. So here's Joe Polzak.
Thank you, sir. Again, I get to come in for the tough part, enforcement, right? So one thing to note here when we go to, as we talk about our city code and go to enforce it, as I mentioned under Pottinger, with the documentation requirement, which you see we implement in policy, we have it in our policy. And by the way, on our zip drives that we have available, we have our policy that pertains to homeless outreach, as well as all of our city code and this presentation, so you'll be able to look through there in more detail. But one thing we found out with documentation is that, of course, what does law enforcement document? Documents it doing its job, right? Which is enforcing the code. So we had this history of enforcement documentation that the ACLU and everybody were waving in front of our face saying, hey, look, the city of Sarasota, all they're doing is enforcing against the homeless. Well, according to our documentation, that appeared to be the case because, again, that's what police departments are tasked with doing. So we realized the police department had to be more, do more and document more. So as we did the 3 E's and required documentation of it, much of which we had done before, now we have documentation of education and encouragement activity, trying to link social services with these individuals. As you'll see when we look at our numbers, that documentation vastly outweighed our actual enforcement action. So just important to note as we go and talk about the city code. And, mea culpa with the city attorney's office. Apparently, the National Coalition for the Homeless, they're big trouble with Sarasota as the meanest city was that ordinance, which is the one we're about to talk about, which was our outdoor lodging ordinance. So, section 3441 of Sarasota City Code, it's lodging out of doors, it's not sleeping. The city of Sarasota does not criminalize sleeping in the city of Sarasota, as some would seek to say. It's lodging, as we'll see, which is basically setting up an encampment. It's erecting a temporary shelter, tent, lean-to, or shack for sleeping purposes or laying down bedding for the purpose of sleeping. Really what we're criminalizing is the lodging, the setting up of a camp. This kind of thing. It presents public safety and health problems, not only to the homeless individuals, but to the entire community. And what we want to do is redirect that into social services rather than enabling it to just exist within our city in an unsustainable and inhospitable environment. So building into the ordinance, we have 5 elements that at least one of which has to, one or more have to exist in order to be cited under the code. Having personal belongings, cooking, having a fire, earth-breaking activities, actually being asleep and saying you have nowhere else to go. Indicia of setting up camp or lodging, not just temporarily sleeping in the city. Built into our ordinance also, consistent with Pottinger, but this isn't pursuant to Pottinger, this is pursuant to our own code, that whenever somebody's encountered that's in violation of our lodging ordinance, they have to be offered presently available shelter. They shall. So the ordinance shall not be enforced unless they're offered presently available shelter and they reject that. And that's what our officers are tasked with doing. Again, all officers are tasked with the 3 E's. And all officers are tasked with offering shelter prior to any camping or lodging out of doors enforcement action. We have it in our operating policy, again, that it shall not be enforced unless there's presently available shelter. And if it is not available, that shall be documented and referred to our supervisor so they can take action as to find out the status of our shelter beds. Now, the lodging activity also spills over into our public spaces, our rights-of-way, with storage of property. Similar to what Miami encountered, obviously we wanted to do it in a humane and just way with due process incorporated into our prohibition. So that's what we did. We did a nationwide search of storage of personal property ordinances, took the best of what's out there, based ours on ones that have been upheld in courts, in various courts of appeal, and came up with 2144. And so, to sum it up, it requires some kind of notice, either through posting or the direct tagging of the property before the property can be removed. So the person is on notice, actual notice, or constructive notice of the prohibition. Once it's person stores the property within a posted area, or the property remains having been tagged for an appropriate period of time under the ordinance, then it can be removed. And there's a period of time where it's stored and they can recover the property. It's had a dramatic effect in our city. Cleaned up our public spaces, created, again, more safe and hospitable environments for people to operate in our city. Yes, we do have a solicitation code. We do not call it panhandling because that's not what it is, but we do have a solicitation code. It has been challenged and survived because it covers three areas. So in-person solicitation are just prohibited in certain places that are not traditional public forum, so they survive constitutional scrutiny. Or in an aggressive manner, that survives constitutional scrutiny. You can't conduct your solicitation in an aggressive manner. Thirdly, we prohibit solicitation between an individual and the occupant of a motor vehicle on arterial roadways. Again, that invokes public safety and health concerns that survive constitutional scrutiny. At the same time, these are effective tools of enforcement and reasonable prohibitions that I think survive a common sense analysis. Lastly, we implemented City Code 30-3, which is a blocking the sidewalk ordinance. Again, having due process built into it, that they can't, somebody can't block a right-of-way, a sidewalk, or an entrance to a building. I mean, there's ADA concerns, public safety concerns for ingress and egress. So that's not allowed, but first, law enforcement has to warn the person that that's what they're doing. It's due process under the law, and it just makes common sense. Lastly, what we did, in addition to the pre-arrest diversion that the captain talked about with really is what the 3 E's are, if somebody's subject of an enforcement action, that they're offered services or shelter prior to being cited and in lieu of being cited. We also enacted post-arrest diversion, participating in the county's comprehensive treatment court, which is a mental health court program, had limited numbers, but we did help fund and support it. To expand the numbers to a greater audience, if you will, we enacted our own Sarasota City Code diversion program, which we give everyone 3 shots at the apple. If they come through violating a city code, they can partake of this. It circles them back around to services and case management that they were offered up front with the 3 E's. They have it on the other side too, that they can partake of in a post-arrest diversion format. And all charges are dropped if they successfully complete it. So again, as the captain said, you can see the national best practices we identified from the federal interagency task force that we took to put into the foundation of our program. You can see how it's all starting to line up. And I know you can't read the text on this, but I just want to comment that this actually is in our policy, our operating policy for our officers to see and use. And what's important to note here, if you look at the color coding, if a subject started out in violation of our city code, the yellow coding is educate and encourage activity. So that's the first thing that takes place. Blue is actual enforcement action. Red is a criminal justice outcome. The green coding is all the service-related outreach and diversion outcomes. So what should be readily apparent from our system is there is only one single criminal justice outcome. That's after having passed through pre-arrest diversion in the form of the 3 E's and rejecting that diversion and then not partaking of the post-arrest diversion of our Sarasota City Code diversion program and the county mental health court program. So really what we're criminalizing then with our city code is not at all the life-sustaining activity. It's the rejection of a lawful, viable alternative. If anyone wants to contact us, we can give you copies of these. These are all the different agreements that went into the bones of the architecture of our program, setting it up and operationalizing what we do. Most important of which, perhaps, is our shelter bed program. I'll have Captain Stiff introduce that.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, sir.
As we talk about the codes, and Joe talked about all the different codes we have, and we talked about educate, encourage, and enforce. The main point of that is I tell every police officer when we do the training, if you're going to enforce the law, all of this judges and citizens that think that all the police department does is drive around and arrest people for being homeless, I want them to be able to tell that judge when they're in court, Your Honor, yes, I've arrested Kevin Stiff for lodging out of doors. But I also have a report here that he's been contacted 15 times and encouraged, educated and encouraged not to do that. So yes, we took enforcement action today. That's the most important part of all the documentation, all the ordinances, and the process that we set up. The hotbeds at the Salvation Army. Approximately 3 years ago, while we're going through this process, we determined that, well, Pottinger requires it, that we have a bed available for any enforcement action we want to take. But also the homeless outreach teams do need an opportunity to have someone, as we say, level out after being taken off the street, to understand where they're at, their new surroundings. So we needed somewhere to put them for some time. We did have an agreement with the Salvation Army, and always had, that if a person is presented by a law enforcement officer, they will take them, regardless of what time of day or night it is. But the problem with those beds that we received, the person ended up on a mat on the floor that was in the dining room, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, that's the dining room. They're getting ready to serve breakfast, so these people have to get up and leave. So they weren't really giving an opportunity to relax in the shelter, because then they had to have breakfast and leave. So, as we said, the policy requires it, as well does the city ordinance require, that we have a bed available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for individuals to be escorted in by a law enforcement officer or a case manager. That is important, because right after we got the beds at the Salvation Army, the ACLU called up, because we started with 6 beds, the ACLU called up and said, I have 6 people that need services, where do I drop them off? I said, no, person has to be escorted in by a law enforcement officer, not anybody off the street. For the first 24 hours, there is no social service counseling, there's no medical treatment, religious instruction, and of course they are EEOC compliant. Basically, we give them 1 free day. You come in, you tell us your name, you have appropriate behavior. If it's the middle of the night, you go in there, lay down, be quiet, you can stay. We call it the additional 2 days, 3 days of comfort. The first day, we make sure 24 hours, there is no other service requirements, so we can get through Pottinger. And we don't have a problem with the individual saying that they were asked to leave or told to leave because they wouldn't participate in any service. All right. Day 2, if you want to stay another day, each morning our homeless outreach teams go to the Salvation Army. They meet with everybody in the hotbeds. They say, okay, you were brought in yesterday, this is your 2nd day. I need your name and I need your information so I can begin to find out what service options you are available, which ones you meet. And they can give them their name if they want to stay. And that's it. They don't have to do any other counseling or any other services, and they get to stay, hang out and relax. They do the same thing the next day. We call it 3 days of comfort. 3 days, showers, clean clothes, 3 meals, hots and a cot, come and go, and relax. But by day 4, they have to be prepared to start discussing, either we are a housing first city, they have to be prepared to discuss a plan for them to go to housing if they want to continue. That's day 4, 5, 6, and 7. What we're trying to accomplish with our homeless outreach teams is what's called a warm handoff. In a lot of these social programs, Kevin Stiff will come into a shelter, they'll put Kevin Stiff into the program, and they'll say, Kevin Stiff, we have an opportunity for you to go to housing. I'm going to have a case manager meet with you in a week. See you in a week. And that person, the case manager, most case managers, they sit in their office and they got a note on their calendar that says Kevin Stiff's supposed to be here at 7 o'clock. He missed his appointment. He didn't get it. We understand these individuals that we're working with are probably difficult, and they probably don't have a calendar. So they're going to miss some appointments. So what we're trying to accomplish in our 4 days of choice is my case manager gets on the phone with where that person's going and says, hey, I've got Kevin Stiff here. He needs an appointment. I think he has met the criteria to get rapid rehousing. When can we get together with him? They will take them to that appointment. They will make sure they get there and they say, hey, this is Kevin Stiff. He's been working with me. These are his records. I will help him through there, and we will be his advocate. As I told you, some of our social services aren't working well. My case manager is that advocate that says, you told Kevin Stiff that you were going to work with him and get him into a house. What had happened? Why have you not progressed him through his process, and why isn't he in a house? They will continue to make those contacts. The Salvation Army currently has given us a case manager for each 10 beds. We have 20 beds right now, so we have 2 case managers, besides my own case manager with the H.O.T team that go out, 2 case managers that work with the clients in those beds to help them get the housing or other services. As I said in the beginning, our experts said that the Salvation Army did not meet the criteria of a shelter, said it was not sufficient because it was a church. And we said, well, HUD and FEMA seem to believe it is. They give them a lot of money to be a homeless shelter. One person at a time. That is how the homeless outreach team tries to identify individuals for housing, one person at a time. But most important, when we started the process with Pottinger, we had 1,100 homeless people in our city. And it was their belief that if we wanted to enforce any life-sustaining conduct, we needed a shelter that housed 1,100 people. Big shelter. And I always said, well, if it's 1,100 now and it's 1,200 next week, do we have to build a bigger shelter? Or do we stop enforcing? No, as Joe finally figured out through our journey down this trail, you only have to have 1 bed available to do enforcement action at the time you're doing it. The 4th E, everybody has this one. It's called enablement. I always love the conversations I have with individuals that tell me they felt so good. I had an individual, he says, I felt so good. For 4 years, this guy stood on the corner every morning when I went to work. I gave him $5. He finally got housing. He says, I felt so good assisting him for those 4 years till he got housing. I said, really? I said, when do you think he'd have made the choice if you hadn't enabled him to live on the street for 4 years? They just look at you. What do you mean? Churches and other people that feed on the street. We have several churches and other organizations that feed on our street in our downtown area. I will spend an hour talking to them about all the problems that they cause by feeding in our parking lots. The trash, the urinating, defecating, the loitering, the businesses go insane. I ask them 2 things. Do us a favor. Take the feeding to your church. Oh no, our parishioners won't put up with that. I tell them, well, okay, what is your goal in what you're doing? They always say, well, we want to end homelessness. Okay, well then tell me what you're doing. How does that reach that goal? Does it end homelessness? Well, no, we're just trying to sustain them until they get there. I say the services are available. You've just got to quit sustaining them on the street. So then I ask them finally, because I only give them 1 hour, because the conversation always ends the exact same way. After I've spent this time with them, the last word of the conversation is, it's God's work, God's calling for me, and we're going to continue to do it. So we continue to work with churches and other people that feed on our street to try to get them to stop. The bridge to services, we've talked about this. In the beginning, my homeless outreach team was putting people on the bridge to services. We have to make sure there's someone on the other side. Because, as I told you, some of these social service organizations aren't doing real well. And we've recently had an expert come into our city. Her card is up front here. She looked at our organization. She said, your organizations aren't doing very good at all. Because there is a scorecard out there, and we weren't making much progress. But there are numerous organizations doing phenomenal things for homeless people. I will tell you, everybody has a heart in the right place. Sometimes they're not getting to where they need to be. But everybody wants to provide the best. But there is just a pyramid of issues when you try to house someone. And the best part of most social services, they get graded on what they do. So they're trying to house people that are easiest to house. And the ones that are most difficult, the chronically homeless that we all deal with, they're not very easy to house. We don't want to pick them up. Is anybody here from Nashville? Nobody here from Nashville? What is a continuum of care? Almost all of y'all have a continuum of care in your area. It is a umbrella organization over all social services for homelessness. It was created by the 2009 Hearth Act, which was originally the McKenty-Vento Act. You need to know what your continuum of care is in your area. They are the one determining who gets services and who gets money. In our area, it is Suncoast Partnership to End Homelessness for our county area. They are in charge of doing the point-in-time survey. A point-in-time survey, it's all the homeless people in your area are counted in January every year. And then they put out a report. And this is part of the problem, if you're not paying attention, and we weren't in 2014, that they can cause you. Homelessness in the city of Sarasota was a city problem. It was not a county problem. Why? Because they did the point in time every year, and they found out all the homeless were in the city. The county's 500 square miles outside the city didn't have but one homeless person. In 2014, they had 0. I griped in 2014. In 2015, they gave me 1. I said, I drive through the county all the time. I see homeless people everywhere. You're telling me they only have 1? Yes. They also operate your homeless management information system. It's a huge database in your area that can basically tell you the name of every homeless person or person that needs services in your area. But it's important to you to understand we are now on the board of our continuum of care. I'm having a problem here. All right. Mission, message, and management. I talk about this all the time. What is the mission? The mission in a homeless outreach team is to be the bridge to services. My police officers is to do outreach, diversion, and enforce the rule of law. The message, how do we get this to everybody to understand what we're doing, was simple. 3 E's. Somebody asked me, what plan do you have to get individuals to services off the street and to reduce the homeless problem in the city of Sarasota? The 3 E's. Educate, encourage, and enforce. Management. As this process went over the past 4 years, the management is the most difficult thing because everybody wants to change the mission. Once you get all these other people involved in your conversation, they think you need to do something different. As I said, someone constantly calls me and tells me, I am a homeless expert and I know how to solve your homeless problem. No, thank you. People in the service organizations, they want you to offer services. No, we don't offer services. We are the bridge to services. It's your job to offer services. And social workers tell you all the time, I don't mind the 2 E's, the educate and encourage, but you really shouldn't do any enforcement. And I say, well, we believe that there is always going to be a few outliers out there that need enforcement. Currently, we are working with the Florida Housing Coalition on a new plan that has developed some cooperation within the city and the county. We do outreach and coordinated entry, diversion and prevention, emergency shelter that we have. The county's only opened up 30 beds as well, so we're going to have 50 beds at our Salvation Army. Rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Everybody loves this plan because as soon as it was introduced, everybody completely forgot about the last 2 bubbles. Housing. I said, I don't care how much emergency shelter we have, because that's all they wanted, somewhere to drop them off. I said, it's a plan that we've all agreed to work on, which includes rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. I'm going to be measuring that as we move forward over the next 2 years to make sure that this is what we're doing. We're not looking for a place to warehouse homeless people. Success. Joe Polzak.
Sir. So we didn't make too bad of a team, although I still don't like to be the Gilligan character, but I guess I'll deal with it. So one thing to note, I would just quickly note, as to this Florida Housing Coalition, the beauty of this kind of programming is you're incorporating existing social service architecture into what you do, and that's what they are good at. And as soon as we did that, we had the Florida Housing Coalition jump in and want to build out further the back end of our program, right? And build it into a housing first program. And so as people are coming into this continuum of care of services, they're being triaged into housing and into other services. That was a great thing for us to see happening. So we had some good travels and discovered some good programming. And I think at the end of the day, you know, it meets Pottinger and it meets what the DOJ is looking for. It meets what the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness has identified. We're using our community policing tactics, but we're still enforcing the rule of law while offering decriminalization of life-sustaining conduct crimes. And we do that by deploying existing social services to where the homeless are, and then also diverting them in the middle of enforcement action. So, you know, it's consistent, as the chief mentioned, with our mission to protect and serve all members of our community. And in that way, we are truly making friends with the monster. So I would just like to note, as you know, the lawyer being involved, seeing what law enforcement had to go through, seeing a police agency being so embedded and take on so many social service tasking. This is really not unique to Sarasota. It's indicative of the transformational changes that are occurring throughout our society. And as Exhibit A, I would note.
Yes, I would have, 38 years ago, I would have never dreamed I'd see a picture of me serving meals to homeless at the Salvation Army. Someone told me the other day when I was out on the street and I called for a homeless outreach team, it was one of my lieutenants. He says, now there's a sentence I never thought would come out of your mouth. So all of us can change. I never thought that I'd measure contacts in any other way, or what a law enforcement officer was doing other than how many felonies, misdemeanors, and tickets did you write. No, now we measure success with how much educating, encouraging, and homeless individuals have you got to the Salvation Army Social Services. Last year, I have 2 homeless outreach teams. Last year, those 2 teams made 11,370 contacts with homeless individuals in our city. That's a lot of repeat contacts. That's a lot of evidence for court when someone says, you're not doing anything but arresting homeless people. No, we have a whole lot of contacts with homeless individuals that we do nothing, because those 11,000 contacts are nothing but educating and encouraging them to services. We have a homeward bound program. We put them on a bus if they want to go home to family. They give me a hard time about, why are you busing your homeless people out of the city of Sarasota? I say, I'm not. I'm sending them home to their family. That is their support group. How could you tell me, a stranger, that your own family would not be a better support group and understanding of what your needs are than your family? I'm sending them home. We've sent 951 people to the Salvation Army for a night's stay. Out of those, approximately 60% have requested and received additional services from one of these services in the continuum of care. The other shelter I went to in 2014, when I asked them, how many people leave this area here, which was a mat on the floor, to go into the social service side of your shelter? He said about 5%. I said, oh my God, if 5% walk through the door, actually how many get any services? He said, we don't keep that number. I said, what? Okay. The ACLU, shocking statement. I don't believe they deserve the title the meanest city anymore. They also said we've become progressive in the treatment of homelessness. A few months ago, we had one of our officers in the middle of the night arrested a homeless individual in a wheelchair. We arrested her right after the victim came up and said, this person stole my wheelchair and I want her prosecuted. But of course, the police officer arrests her, takes her to jail, and the next morning in the newspaper, disabled homeless person arrested on wheelchair. And isn't there a better place for a disabled homeless person than in jail? Why are these mean police officers still doing nothing but arresting homeless individuals? Through our program that we put together in our system, we began documenting. I called the reporter. He was glad to hang up with me an hour later. I told him, I said, sir, are you aware over the past 3 months, my homeless outreach team has contacted that person 150 times and offered her services? Were you aware that we actually took her to a house that she abandoned? Are you aware this is the 3rd wheelchair that she's stolen, and the victim just wants her to stop stealing the wheelchairs? Are you aware that we had an opportunity, since we had charged her with a felony because it is a $3,000 wheelchair, Are you aware that we had an opportunity to send her to mental health court and get her off the street? But since your newspaper has made such a big deal about this, the victim dismissed the charges, and we no longer have a hold over her. We did take her to another organization to provide her housing, but she walked away from that as well. But the nice part of this was, that reporter wrote another story and said, maybe he was wrong. That the Sarasota Police Department has done everything it can do to protect the homeless individuals in the city. 2015, 1,106 homeless individuals in our city. Sarasota had 816 in 2016. But just remember, I had frequently been arguing the point in time was wrong because the continuum of care was doing the point in time count wrong. So they didn't even put Sarasota County on here, so I argued some more, and they finally figured out that, well, yes, they had mistakenly put 165 people that were in the county in the city, so our number actually decreased down to 632. But more importantly, I can't see the slide here. It went from 632 to 429 in 2017. That is a 32% drop in 1 year. Since 2015, we've reduced homelessness in the city of Sarasota by 61%. I don't know if we call that success, but I do. We've received numerous awards. We received the Congressional Citation. Again, transformation. I presented at a social service conference in Philadelphia earlier this year. I don't think I'd ever see that. We've had the opportunity to speak here. We're going to receive the Humane and Civil Rights Award tomorrow night. Or Monday? Yes, tomorrow night.
Tuesday night.
We'll be speaking at another social service conference later this month. Community engagement, mission, message, and management, best practice. Is this
That's video.
Gotta hit that.
This is
Go
the
ahead.
ending slide. I'll get this in a second. But I will tell you, this was not possible. This has been, for me, a very stressful journey. I will tell you, as a law enforcement officer, this was the toughest issue I've ever had to fight because it's been a fight since day one. I told you, me and a buddy of mine went on a trip out west. We have not spoke since that trip. There's a lot of people that I do not speak to anymore. They don't speak to me because we have a difference of opinion of how this problem should be handled, as does many of the people in your community will have that problem. This was only possible by the chief of police. There's many times I was doing stuff that I said, boy, this don't go where she might get fired. But she supported me the entire way. I've had Joe Paulzak to make sure I don't go rogue. He is.
It's been a full-time job.
I think he's been. I think she assigned him to me secretly. Don't let him speak without you being there. I had a sergeant who's now a captain, a female sergeant, phenomenal. She helped me get through some of the tougher times. When people said, I didn't say that, I was the mean guy. Nobody ever believed what I said, but she said, yeah, you did. Then we have another sergeant, Richie Sweeterman. He'll be with us tomorrow night. He took the team even further than I ever could. I wish I could say it had anything to do with me, but it had to do with the fact that I had an opportunity to have great people work with me. And here's an endings video.
When I first came here as the chief in the Sarasota Police Department, I found homelessness was one of the #1 issues facing our community. At first I thought, that's not a police department issue, except for that we were getting the complaints because we responded to those 911 calls and those complaints for service that citizens were calling us about an individual that was asleep on a bench or didn't smell very well or was acting strangely out in the community. And the community and our elected officials and our government, they expected us to do something about it. So what we did is we did our homework and research. I sent one of my best captains out on the road to take a look at what these best practices were that other jurisdictions were using. And he came back with this program, the Homeless Outreach Team, using the 3 E's, educate, encourage, and enforce. And we were able to pair up our police officers with civilian caseworkers to go out onto the street, engage individuals, help them get into the resources, whether it was the Salvation Army or Harvest House or the Resurrection House and the multitude of other organizations throughout our community that could actually get people the help to eventually get them off the street and into permanent housing.
We had opportunities in the first year to put over 7,000 people in contact with service providers. And we saw that it began to take hold in the city. Our complaints on homelessness began to decline, so we developed a second team of homeless outreach officers. And those officers on a daily basis go out and contact homeless individuals, educate them on the services that are available, and try to get them to take those services. In 2015, the homeless outreach team made over 11,000 contacts with homeless individuals in our city. That is a lot of repeat contacts.
One of the most exciting parts for me to be involved in this program as a lawyer is to see the tangible results on the street. We've noted a year-over-year decline in the homeless population in our city of over 30%. And over a 2-year period, we documented over 60% decline through the Department of Housing and Urban Development point-in-time survey. To me, this is an exciting and amazing opportunity to be part of that success, along with the Patrol Division Captain, the Chief of Police, and everyone here at SPD who's an integral part of implementing and operationalizing this very successful program.
Well, the homeless outreach teams have been a dramatic success here. I can't really envision a better way to approach it. And we have seen dramatic decreases in the numbers of people on the streets and significant improvements on those who are returning to a healthy lifestyle. And of course, our litigation has begun to decrease as well.
All right, Bob.
Absolutely, and citywide, there's been a chronic reduction in homeless individuals that are chronically homeless on the street. Some, they qualify for services, they receive benefits, they might be veterans, they have access to Social Security, and we were able to connect them with case managers who can get them signed up and actually receiving services. Sometimes there's a gap where they just need to be reunited with loved ones, and so we're able to provide financial assistance in getting individuals back to cities where their loved ones live.
So we made it off the island. Do I have any questions? That's our presentation.
So if you have any questions, please come up to the mic. We're happy to answer those questions. Before you leave, please come up and grab one of our flash drives and our business card. And I will reiterate to you the importance of marketing your programs and educating your community about not enabling the homeless. 92 cents out of every dollar that you give to a homeless person goes to drugs, alcohol, or prostitution. So it's not actually helping people, it's keeping them down and could ultimately lead their death. Lieutenant Passini.
Hey, how are you? Can you hear me? I have 3 questions. With respect to your homeless teams, how many guys do you put out on the street? And how much resources with respect to money are you putting out there? That's the first question. Second one is, when you take their property, I don't know if you're logging that or what are you doing with that property that sometimes could be almost a biohazard? And third, the Pottinger case, is that taking root nationwide, or is it just in Florida in your circuit? So one for each of you, I guess.
Well, the first question is, currently we have 2 homeless outreach teams. I got 5 people assigned to the homeless team. I have 2 homeless outreach team officers, 2 case managers. I also have 2 police officers that do nothing but enforcement. This is not like I said, this is not a social service program. We do actively enforce the law, and we got 2 officers that do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also have a sergeant in charge of the group. What it costs annually, including the beds we have at the Salvation Army, is about $500,000 a year when I include the officers, the beds, and the other the ascenders vehicles and stuff like that. It's about $500,000 a year. It includes the homeward bound tickets. What was your second question?
Well, it's also important to note that the captain and Joe have educated every officer in our department so that everyone knows how to do this program. You just don't want it to be this unit. This unit, that is their #1 responsibility, but every officer can encounter a homeless individual and they need to know what to do. The question about property is, we document every single item that we take. We actually have a special area near our public works where we have containers where we can house those items, worried about some of them possibly being biohazards. And we also educate people as to, if you find trash on your property, you're allowed to throw away trash on your private property, but if you call us, we're going to have to take it into custody, and if you ask us if you have to keep it, we're going to have to tell you, yes, we have to keep it. And we store it for that period of time, and then we have a process where after those days we're mandated to keep it by ordinance, we then dispose of those items as all of you do. And the last question was Pottinger.
Pottinger, yeah, you are seeing that nationwide. I mean, you saw it in the Joel versus City of Orlando case. The DOJ's position paper in Boise was very Pottinger-esque in their language. And I think the ACLU would probably tell you that it does apply.
But it is not
nationwide.
law, okay? It was a settlement agreement. And the ACLU is using that, though, as its basic holy grail, the Bible, to mitigate and legislate and also litigate
Right.
all of the things that a city does dealing with it. So if you use these guidelines and actually embrace it, as we did the monster, we embraced it and we utilized it in our ordinances, in our practices, and it gave the flavor of Pottinger. That helped us to get the ACLU to recognize we were actually not the meanest city anymore, which was ultimately my guide, my goal. So.
And there's so many best practices out there that are consistent with that you can implement, that are consistent with our mission to protect and serve, which is ultimately what we're all here to
We
do.
also, besides having an agreement with the Salvation Army, because we knew we were limited in the number of beds that technically the city had, because we started out with 10 and then moved up gradually where we could go up to 30 beds. We also made agreements with other resources like hotels within the area, that if we needed an emergency to put a family or an individual in a hotel, we made agreements with them. But that's even challenging, because then do we take on the liability of putting someone that maybe has mental health issues, addictions issues, could cause problems and wreck a hotel room? Do we assume that liability? Of course, our attorney told us yes. So, but we still felt like, yes, we still needed to do that. And we made it regionalized, not just in the city of Sarasota, so that we could actually, spread out, the opportunities for people within our community to have places to be able to go to. And we rarely had to use that. The Salvation Army, the beds there is, worked for us, and there are times when the beds are full, and what we do is we actually notify our officers via email. You can no longer enforce those ordinances until those beds free up, but that's very rarely happened. I can't say the exact number of times, but it very rarely happens where all of our beds are filled. So any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I just want to congratulate you on your successes. It sounds like you're tackling a very difficult problem and obviously having some visible results. Yet I saw there were 429 people still accounted for as homeless in your city. And I work in the Denver metropolitan area. We have tried some different approaches and added another layer, and what we're doing is having public restrooms and showers on trailers, making available storage lockers, and just dealing with some of the more visible aspects of homelessness. In addition, tiny homes are being built on vacant lots to give people a step up and actually a roof over their head. I'm curious if you've reached out and tried some of those approaches.
We have numerous public restrooms in our downtown corridor, and if an officer is using the ordinance for urinating and defecation, they will note that the location is and how close it is to a public restroom, because the use of restrooms was mentioned in Pottinger in the earlier version. It's not mentioned in the current version, but we do put that in there, and we tell the officers that, there's a difference between urinating and defecation in public and hiding behind a dumpster using the restroom. But we have not had to put public restrooms. As far as tiny houses, we are working with code compliance and zoning to determine whether or not we can put those in the city. Some people have.
We like the idea, and we think that's a great idea. We had just to make sure we have the zoning, and they can change the zoning ordinances. We've learned more about things that are non-law enforcement in our trek in this adventure, about zoning and locations. There's so many things, but we are looking at that because we think that is a viable program, because affordable housing in the city of Sarasota is very difficult. We have the richest of the rich, I found, and the poorest of the poor all living and competing for those resources. And nobody really wants to take a multi-million-dollar future complex and put necessarily tiny houses there. But the city is looking at the housing first, looking at developing unique opportunities to develop programs like that. And we have a place called, because you asked about showering, the Resurrection House within our community actually allows people to go there to be able to take showers. It is such a enabling program that you can walk in as a homeless individual, drop off your dirty clothes. The people there are so kind-hearted. They take the clothes, wash them, dry them, fold them, and then give them back to the homeless individuals. So we do have those kind of programs for individuals. I assure you that we are not short on resources for homeless within our community, but there will always be a number of individuals within communities that refuse to partake in services. I've personally, as the chief of police, gone out and talked to individuals, and I'm like, we can help you. Let us help you. We can get you into housing eventually. We have the resources. And the guy says, I don't want that. I'm making $500 to $600 a day out on the street. And if I had to have a house, I don't want to take care of it. I don't want that responsibility. And there are some individuals who just don't want that. They're the hardest of the hard cases. But I can tell you the hope that I've seen. We had one guy that was on our streets named, I'm not even going to use his name, but he was one of our chronic cases, and he hung out in the downtown area, and the restaurants fed him all the time. And in my mind, they were keeping him as a pet. But they thought they were doing a nice thing by providing him food, and he just never got the help. And you knew he was around because as soon as you were about 2 blocks away, you could smell him, and everyone knew of this gentleman. We finally were able to, through the 3 E's, get to the point where we had enough to enforce the law on him, and he had a choice to go to jail or go into a deferment program. He initially said jail. After 2 days, he decided, no, I think I want to go into the deferment program. I mean, we even sent a psychiatrist out on the street because he has mental health issues to try to diagnose him as in Florida, it's the Baker Act, to get people with mental health into help and services. They're like, no, he's clear, he's fine. And we're like, are you kidding? He talks to himself, he's shouting, he can't take care of himself. What eventually happened was one of our business owners was able to adopt, and I'm using that term loosely, Joe will give you the legal term, but able to take over legal, being able to direct where his life went and what he did, and they were able to get him into a program so he's no longer on the streets. To me, that's the most successful case. And as Kevin told you, as Captain Stiff told you, we're looking at this one person at a time. We cannot, as I started off, we can't end homelessness in our communities. It's just impossible. We're going to have 400, we're going to have 100, but we're going to keep fighting till we get down to striving to get down to the lowest numbers possible. And we're doing it by engaging with that one person, finding out what their needs are, and getting them the help they need, one person at a time. And it's led us to over a 61% reduction in homelessness in our community. I'm proud of that because that is what police officers' jobs are about, is helping those in need, not arresting our way out of it. And I'm really proud that we're going to be recognized at the ICP. It's one of the most prestigious awards, in my opinion, Tuesday night. And I hope that you'll be able to adopt this program, even with your state laws possibly being a little different than Florida. I can tell you our sunshine laws are a nightmare. Our public records laws, everything is open to scrutiny and public record, which is good for transparency, but oh my gosh, operationally it's very challenging. But we follow that, and your laws might be a little bit different, but please adopt this program, consider it, cater it to your own jurisdiction, what their needs and what their wants are, and don't hesitate to contact any one of us to help you with how we were able to implement this program. Yes?
I would like to know how this initiative has impacted your crime stats, as far as, because this is interrelated with my jurisdiction. We have an increase in petty thefts. We're breaking into cars. That's killing my stats right
Yes.
now. And also interrelated with the drug population, because I have drug dealers, you know, that's their customers.
Yes.
So how has it impacted this program? Because I see the 61% decrease in the homeless part, but how has it affected the crime stats? Because
Crime
they're
has gone down.
interrelated.
They are absolutely interrelated. It's funny, all of our crimes are the same. The homeless are going through the car doors and breaking into unlocked cars, and there's drug dealers that target them. Our crime rate has gone down every single year for the past 5 years, and significantly. And I believe that this does have a direct impact on that. We're, knock on wood, are at an 8% on the 8% decline this year so far in our Part 1 crimes that we track. And in the past several years, we've been down every single year significantly. And so I think it is a direct correlation.
And do you get valuable intel from the homeless population?
We do.
All right.
Absolutely, we do.
So that's one of the positive sides of the engagement. Right?
It is, and the trust that the homeless individuals have with our police officers is invaluable. And we actually had a teacher from the Orlando area come work undercover in our jurisdiction. He had gone to multiple other jurisdictions. We didn't know he was coming. He came and posed as a homeless individual just to see, because he had heard we were this mean city, and what he encountered was just the opposite because of our programs. And he was able to tout how he felt safe, that he felt like he wasn't targeted because he was homeless, and that he felt that the confidence that we built with the relationships we built with the homeless made it a trusting, open relationship that absolutely gives us intel and feeds us information on various things going on with the community, including where other homeless are, who committed certain crimes. So that relationship, it's just like with the general population. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. Congratulations on the award and
Thank
good
you.
luck.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? All right, well, that concludes our contact information's here. Please come up and grab one of the flash drives. They have all of our contact information on them.